The autumn wind whispered through the skeletal branches of Blackwood Forest, carrying secrets long buried beneath layers of fallen leaves and forgotten time. In the quiet town of Eldridge, where the past clung to every weathered porch and crooked street lamp, Eleanor Hayes had always been drawn to the relics of yesteryear. As an archivist at the local historical society, she spent her days sifting through dusty albums and brittle letters, piecing together lives that had faded into obscurity. But nothing prepared her for the yellowed photograph that arrived one crisp October morning in 2025, wrapped in faded newsprint from nearly a century ago. The image depicted a wedding party from 1925, frozen in sepia-toned joy outside a grand Victorian manor on the edge of the woods. The bride, radiant in lace, clutched a bouquet of wilted roses. The groom, stern yet handsome, stood tall beside her. Guests milled about with glasses raised, their smiles etched in eternal celebration. Yet it was the ornate mirror propped against the manor's wall, meant perhaps as a decorative flourish, that caught Eleanor's eye during the restoration process. As digital enhancements peeled away the veil of age and grime, something impossible materialized in its glassy depths, a blurred silhouette, humanoid yet distorted, lurking just beyond the reflected crowd. It seemed to stare back, not at the wedding revelers, but directly through the lens, as if aware of eyes yet unborn. That night, as Eleanor pored over the enhanced print in her dimly lit study, the house creaked with the weight of silence. Outside, the forest loined the heart of Eldridge, a small New England town where the streets wound like forgotten memories and the air always carried the faint scent of pine from the encroaching Blackwood Forest. There stood an old Victorian house on the outskirts, abandoned for decades. Its windows were boarded, its paint peeled in long, sorrowful strips, and ivy had claimed the porch as its own, weaving through the railings like veins. Locals avoided it, not out of superstition alone, but because the house had belonged to the Harrington family, wealthy landowners who, after the tragic events of the late 1920s, simply vanished from public life. The property passed through distant relatives, then to the town, and finally fell into quiet ruin, a silent monument to unanswered questions. It was on a grey afternoon in early October 2025 that Eleanor Hayes, the meticulous archivist at the Eldridge Historical Society, received an unexpected delivery. A plain cardboard box, postmarked from a law firm in Boston, arrived without ceremony. Inside, wrapped in brittle newsprint dated September 1925, lay a collection of personal effects from the Harrington estate, a silver locket, a few tarnished rings, and a stack of photographs carefully tied with faded ribbon. The attorney's note was brief: upon the death of the last surviving heir, these items were to be donated to the town's historical archives. Eleanor carried the box to the back room of the society's modest building, a space filled with the comforting mustiness of old paper and leather bindings. She worked alone that day, the soft hum of the fluorescent light overhead the only company. As she untied the ribbon, the photographs spilled across the table like fragments of a dream. Most were ordinary, family portraits, holiday gatherings, children posed stiffly on lawns. But one image stopped her cold. It was a wedding photograph, larger than the others, its edges scalloped with age. Taken in 1925, it captured a scene of muted elegance outside what was unmistakably the Harrington Manor, the same house now crumbling at the edge of the woods. The bride stood at the center, veiled in delicate lace, her bouquet of roses already beginning to wilt even in the captured moment. The groom, tall and composed, gazed at her with an intensity that felt almost possessive. Around them, guests in flapper dresses and tailored suits raised glasses, their faces bright with forced cheer. Behind them, propped against the manor's stone wall as if for decoration, hung an ornate mirror with an elaborately carved frame. The glass was clouded with age, reflecting only vague shapes of the crowd. Eleanor leaned closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. The photograph had been stored poorly, scratches and discoloration marred its surface, obscuring details. Yet even in its damaged state, it carried an unsettling weight, as though the people within it were waiting for something or someone to notice them again. She set it aside carefully, intending to digitize and restore it later, unaware that this single image, unearthed from a forgotten attic after nearly a century of darkness, would soon pull her into a mystery far deeper than faded ink and silver halide. The house had kept its secrets well, but the photograph was no longer willing to stay silent. Eleanor Hayes had restored hundreds of photographs in her career, coaxing life back into faces blurred by time, scratches, and chemical decay. The process was methodical, almost meditative, scanning at high resolution, layering digital adjustments, removing stains pixel by pixel until the past sharpened into focus. She approached the 1925 wedding image with the same quiet confidence, setting it on the flatbed scanner in the Historical Society's cramped workroom late one November evening in 2025. The overhead light buzzed faintly, casting long shadows across shelves of archived boxes, while outside the window's Blackwood forest pressed close, its branches scraping the glass whenever the wind stirred. At first, the enhancements revealed only what she expected. The bride's lace veil regained its delicate pattern, the groom's eyes sharpened with a clarity that made his gaze almost uncomfortably direct, and the guests' smiles emerged from the haze of age, some genuine, others strained. The manor house behind them stood proud again, its stone facade crisp, the ivy trimmed and orderly. Eleanor worked slowly, adjusting contrast, balancing tones, erasing the mottled spots that time had scattered across the print like freckles. She paused occasionally to sip cold coffee, the only sound the soft click of her mouse and the distant hum of the building's old heater. Then she reached the mirror. Propped against the manor wall in the original composition, it had always been a curious detail, an ornate oval frame with swirling carvings that caught stray light, its surface dulled by decades of dust and silvering loss. In the raw scan it reflected little more than vague silhouettes of the wedding party, distorted shapes that blended into the background. Eleanor selected the area carefully, applying targeted clarification, increasing sharpness, recovering hidden midtones. Layer by layer, the glass began to clear. A chill settled in the room as the reflection resolved. At first it seemed a trick of over-sharpening, an artifact, perhaps, or a shadow cast by someone standing just outside the camera's frame. But as she refined the adjustment, the shape held. In the restored mirror stood a figure that had no place among the joyous crowd. Tall and indistinct, it hovered at the edge of the reflection, its outline humanoid yet wrong, limbs too elongated, posture unnaturally still. The face was a smudge of darkness, featureless except for two pale spots where eyes might have been, fixed not on the wedding scene unfolding before it but outward, toward the lens. Toward whoever might one day look back. Eleanor leaned closer to the screen, her breath fogging briefly in the cool air. The figure did not match any guest visible in the foreground. No one in the wedding party stood in a position that could cast such a reflection. She zoomed in, the pixels straining under magnification, but the presence remained, woven into the very grain of the restored image as if it had always been waiting beneath the decay. The longer she stared, the more the room seemed to quiet, the forest outside falling unnaturally silent, as though the photograph itself had drawn the night closer to listen. With the restored image still glowing on her screen, Eleanor felt compelled to learn more about the people captured within it. She began cross-referencing the faces against the Historical Society's records, starting with the manor itself. The Victorian house, once the pride of Eldridge, had been built in 1892 by Reginald Harrington, a timber baron whose fortune came from the vast tracts of Blackwood forest that bordered the town. By the 1920s the family remained prominent, though increasingly reclusive, their gatherings confined to the estate's shadowed grounds. The bride was identified quickly, Clara Ashwood Harrington, 23 years old at the time of the wedding, the only child of a Boston banking family who had married into the Harrington line in the summer of 1925. Newspaper clippings from the society pages described the ceremony as lavish yet strangely private, held not in a church but on the manor lawn, with guests arriving by invitation only. The groom, Victor Harrington, Reginald's eldest son, was 30, heir to the dwindling lumber empire and known for his intense interest in folklore and antiquities. Photographs of him in earlier years showed a man who stared at the camera with the same unsettling directness now sharpened in the restored print. As Eleanor dug deeper, patterns emerged that unsettled her more than the figure in the mirror. The Harrington estate lay at the very edge of Blackwood Forest, a dense, primeval woodland that had resisted logging longer than any other in the region. Old maps marked the area with warnings, swamps that swallowed surveyors, ridges where compasses spun wildly, clearings avoided even by indigenous tribes long before European settlement. Town law spoke of lights seen deep among the trees on certain nights, of travelers who entered the woods and emerged days later with no memory of the lost time, or who never emerged at all. By the late 1920s, after the wedding, the disappearances grew noticeable enough to reach the regional papers. A farmhand gone missing while cutting firewood along the estate boundary. 2 young women from Eldridge who ventured in to pick berries and were never found. A surveyor hired by the town to map the property line, discovered weeks later wandering the roads, mute and hollow-eyed. Each case was quietly dismissed accidents, runaways, the perils of untamed land, but the Harrington name appeared in every report, either as the last known employer or the owner of the land where the person was last seen. Eleanor found a faded ledger in the archives listing payments from Victor Harrington to local authorities shortly after each incident, sums described as contributions to search efforts. The wedding photograph, taken just months before the vanishings began in earnest, now felt less like a celebration and more like a threshold. The couple at its center had bound themselves not only to each other but to the estate and the dark woods beyond it, a place that seemed to claim lives the way the tide claims driftwood. The mirror's impossible reflection lingered in her mind as she closed the files late that night, its silent figure watching from a space no one in 1925 should have occupied. By mid-December 2025, the restored wedding photograph had become a fixture on Eleanor's desk, propped against a stack of books where the light from her lamp caught the mirror's newly revealed figure each evening. She told herself she kept it there for further study, to cross-reference faces or catalogue details, but the truth was simpler. She could not bring herself to put it away. The image had taken on a quiet presence in the small apartment above the Historical Society, its sepia tones warming under the glow of the single bulb, the impossible silhouette in the glass watching with endless patience. Eleanor had always considered herself rational, immune to the ghost stories that drifted through Eldridge like wood smoke. Yet the nights grew longer, and the silence of her rooms deeper, until one evening, as she sat reviewing notes under the hush of fresh snowfall, she heard it for the first time, a faint murmur, barely more than a breath, rising from the direction of the desk. She froze, pen poised above the page, certain it was the old radiator or wind finding a crack in the window frame. But the sound came again, softer, layered, as though several voices overlapped in a distant conversation just beyond hearing. She turned slowly. The photograph sat unchanged, the wedding party still smiling beneath the winter lamplight, yet the whispers seemed to emanate from its surface, threading through the air like cold fingers. They were not words at first, only cadence, rising, falling, urgent. Eleanor leaned closer, telling herself it was imagination, fatigue, anything but what her skin insisted it was. The voices sharpened, still indistinct, carrying the quality of pleading or warning, rising and falling in rhythm with her own quickening pulse. That night she left the print face down, but sleep brought no relief. In the dark, the murmurs returned, clearer now, brushing against her ear as if someone stood at the bedside. She sat upright, heart hammering, and switched on the lamp. The room was empty, snow tapping softly at the panes, yet the air felt crowded, expectant. When her gaze fell on the overturned photograph, the whispers quieted, as though waiting for her to lift it again. Over the following nights the pattern repeated. The moment she entered the apartment and the door clicked shut, the voices began, never loud enough to record, never clear enough to transcribe, but persistent, threading through the quiet hours like smoke. They grew familiar, almost intimate, rising whenever her eyes lingered on the restored mirror. Some nights she caught fragments, a woman's soft sob, a man's low caution, names half-formed and swallowed. Eleanor began leaving the radio on, then a podcast, anything to drown them, but the whispers slipped beneath the noise, patient, insistent, as though the photograph had waited a century for someone willing to listen. The whispers had become a constant companion by the time Eleanor decided to search the Harrington collection more thoroughly. Late one January night in 2026, with snow piling against the windows of the Historical Society's storage room, she unearthed a small leather-bound diary tucked inside a forgotten trunk of Victor Harrington's personal effects. The cover was cracked, the pages brittle and foxed, but the handwriting, precise, angular, unmistakably Victor's, remained legible beneath the wavering beam of her flashlight. The entries began innocently enough, records of timber yields, weather observations, notes on local politics. But as Eleanor turned past the meticulous accounts of daily life in 1925, the tone shifted. Victor wrote of evenings spent alone in the manor's library, poring over volumes he had acquired from obscure European antiquarians, books bound in unfamiliar leather, their margins annotated in languages Eleanor could not read. He described a growing fascination with the folklore of Blackwood Forest, dismissing the town's cautionary tales at first, then recording them with increasing seriousness, stories of an ancient presence that dwelled among the oldest trees, a guardian or predator that demanded tribute from those who trespassed too deeply. The entries grew fevered in the weeks leading to the wedding. Victor recounted dreams of shadowed clearings where figures gathered in silence, their faces obscured by branches that moved against the wind. He wrote of discovering a stone circle hidden deep in the woods, its markers carved with symbols that seemed to pulse when moonlight struck them. He confessed a belief that the forest held a door, one that could be opened with the right words, the right offering, at the right moment. The wedding, he implied, was more than a union of families, it was a convergence, a ritual timed to the summer solstice when the veil between worlds thinned. On the eve of the ceremony, the final entry chilled Eleanor most. Victor described gathering with a small circle of trusted guests, names she recognized from the wedding photograph under the cover of night. They carried lanterns into Blackwood Forest, following a path only he seemed to know, to a place where the air grew thick and the trees leaned inward. There, beneath a canopy older than any settlement, they performed what he called the old invitation, speaking phrases passed down through generations of Harrington men, offering tokens of blood and vow. The diary ended abruptly. She understands now. Clara stands ready. Tomorrow we bind what has waited so long. Eleanor closed the book with trembling fingers, the whispers in her apartment suddenly carrying new weight. The wedding photograph, with its impossible figure watching from the mirror, no longer seemed an anomaly of restoration but a record of something that had answered Victor's call. The groom's stern gaze, once merely intense, now read as triumphant, as though he had succeeded in bringing something through on the very day the camera captured their joy. The diary lay heavy in her lap, its pages silent, yet the air around her thrummed with the sense that the invitation, issued a century ago, had finally found its intended recipient. February's thaw turned the paths around Blackwood Forest into slick mud, but Eleanor could no longer ignore the pull. Armed with Victor's diary, a flashlight, and a hand-drawn map sketched from his cryptic references, she set out one overcast afternoon in 2026, following the old estate boundary until the manicured grounds gave way to untamed undergrowth. The trees closed in quickly, their trunks thick and blackened by centuries of damp, the canopy so dense that daylight filtered down in thin, reluctant shafts. Every footfall sank into layers of decayed leaves, releasing a sour, earthy smell that clung to her coat. She walked for nearly an hour, consulting the diary's landmarks, a lightning-scarred oak, a stream that ran backward in local legend until the ground began to rise toward a low ridge. There, half buried beneath moss and creeping vines, she found them, weathered stones arranged in a near-perfect circle, each taller than she expected, their surfaces etched with patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of the eye. The carvings were deep, deliberate spirals that coiled inward, angular glyphs interspersed with shapes resembling eyes or open mouths. Eleanor knelt, brushing away centuries of grime, and felt the stone cold even through her gloves. As she traced one symbol with a cautious finger, a flicker of recognition struck her. She pulled the restored wedding photograph from her backpack, an enlarged print she had begun carrying like a talisman. Holding it up in the dim forest light, she aligned the mirror's ornate frame with her memory of its details. There, faint but unmistakable along the mirror's carved border, were the same motifs now beneath her hand, smaller, stylized, yet identical in sequence and proportion. The mirror had not been a random decorative piece, it had been crafted to echo the circle she now knelt within, perhaps even fashioned from stone dust gathered here. The air grew heavier as she worked her way around the ring, photographing each marker. Birdsong had ceased, even the wind seemed to avoid the clearing. In the center lay a shallow depression, as though something large had once been removed or had pressed down over time. Scattered within it were fragments, shards of darkened glass or obsidian, brittle remnants of ribbon, a single tarnished button that matched the style of the groomsmen's suits in the 1925 image. Eleanor pocketed one shard carefully, its edge unnaturally sharp, and felt a sudden vertigo, as if the ground beneath the circle tilted toward depths far below the forest floor. Kneeling longer than she intended, she became aware of how precisely the stones framed the sky above, creating sightlines that pointed toward constellations Victor's diary had named in archaic terms. The carvings seemed warmer now under her palms, or perhaps her hands had simply gone numb from the cold. She rose slowly, the weight of discovery settling over her like the forest's perpetual dusk, the symbols linking the wedding's polished celebration to this hidden place of older, rawer intent. The mirror, she realized, had not merely reflected the wedding party, it had served as a window, its frame a deliberate echo of the circle now surrounding her, binding the manor's bright lawn to the shadowed heart of Blackwood that night. After returning from the stone circle, Eleanor did not sleep. She sat at her desk with the restored photograph illuminated by a single desk lamp, the forest silence pressing against the apartment walls like a held breath. The whispers that had once been faint and distant now filled the room, no longer muffled by radio or distraction. They came from every direction at once, layered and overlapping, as though dozens of voices spoke in unison from the other side of the mirror's glass. She had carried the shard of obsidian from the clearing, wrapped in a handkerchief, and placed it beside the print. When she finally dared to look at the image again, the figure in the mirror had changed. Where before it had been a blurred silhouette, it now moved slowly, deliberately, its elongated limbs shifting as though adjusting its stance. The pale spots that might have been eyes tracked her movements across the room, following her even when she stepped behind the desk or turned away. The whispers grew clearer, fragmenting into words she could almost grasp. A woman's voice, soft and broken. "Help us. We are still here." A man's low murmur. He promised release." Children's voices, thin and frightened. "It's dark, so dark." Names drifted through: Clara, Victor, others she recognized from the wedding party, spoken not in greeting but in lament, as though each had been waiting a century to be heard. The pleas repeated in endless loops, rising and falling like a tide, sometimes pleading, sometimes accusatory, always tinged with the same desperate hunger. Eleanor sat frozen, the air around her thick and cold. She tried to speak, to ask what they wanted, but her voice cracked and died. The voices answered anyway, threading through the room as though they had been speaking to her all along, waiting for her to listen without interruption. "The door is open," one whispered. "He left it open," another echoed. "We cannot leave. You must close it, or join us." The whispers did not stop when she covered the photograph with a cloth or turned off the lamp. They followed her to the bedroom, seeping through the floorboards, rising from the walls, until the entire apartment seemed to breathe with them. She heard footsteps that matched no rhythm she could place, slow, deliberate, circling the room as though someone paced just beyond the reach of sight. The voices grew more insistent, naming her now: "Eleanor. Eleanor, you saw, you know." By dawn the pleas had become a single, continuous murmur, a chorus of the lost that carried the weight of every disappearance the forest had claimed since 1925. The shard of obsidian on the desk glinted faintly, as though catching light that was not there, and the photograph beneath the cloth seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own. Eleanor understood then that the voices were not merely echoes, they were the trapped remnants of those who had entered Blackwood and never left, bound by Victor's ritual, held in the mirror's reflection like insects in amber. They had waited in silence for nearly a century, but now, through the restored image and the stone circle's echo, they had found a way to speak again, and they would not be silenced until their demand was met. March arrived with a raw wind that stripped the last snow from Blackwood's edges, and Eleanor knew she could no longer remain alone with the voices. The whispers had grown demanding, repeating a single name, Margaret, until she searched the town records and found Margaret Ellison, 87 years old, living in a small clapboard house on the far side of Eldridge. Margaret was the granddaughter of Elias Ellison, one of the groomsmen standing just behind Victor in the wedding photograph, his face now unmistakable in the restored print. Eleanor drove there on a steel-grey morning, the obsidian shard and diary tucked in her coat pocket like evidence. Margaret answered the door slowly, frail but sharp-eyed, her white hair pulled back severely. She studied Eleanor's face, then the folder in her hands, and without a word led her into a parlor that smelled of cedar and old books. Framed photographs lined the mantel, family portraits spanning decades, and among them a smaller version of the 1925 wedding image, its mirror carefully cropped out. Margaret poured tea with steady hands while Eleanor explained, the restoration, the figure, the stone circle, the voices that would not quiet. She laid the enlarged print on the table between them. Margaret's gaze settled on the mirror's reflection, and for the first time her composure faltered. Her fingers tightened around the cup. "My grandfather never spoke of that day," she said at last, voice low, as though the walls might still be listening. "After the wedding he changed. He stopped going to church, stopped working the mill. He'd walk into the woods at dusk and come back hours later, mud to his knees, eyes like he'd seen the bottom of the world. My father said Elias burned his journals, but one page survived, hidden in the family Bible." She rose and retrieved a yellowed sheet from a drawer, handing it to Eleanor. The handwriting matched fragments she had seen in Victor's diary, a confession that the ritual in the clearing had not been mere folklore. They had called something older than the forest itself, an entity that fed on boundaries, between life and death, between promise and betrayal. Victor had believed he could bind it to the Harrington bloodline, gain its favor, perhaps even its knowledge. The mirror, carved from stone taken from the circle, was meant to serve as anchor and gate. But the offering, Clara's willing vow, the guest's silent complicity, had not been enough to control what answered. Margaret's eyes filled as she continued. Elias had tried to warn the others afterward, but fear and shame silenced him. The disappearances began almost immediately, claimed by the thing now tethered to the estate. The family scattered or died young, carrying the curse in their blood. Margaret herself had never married, never had children, determined to let the line end with her. She reached across the table and touched the photograph's edge. "It's still hungry," she whispered. "It takes what wanders too close, keeps them in that place between. My grandfather's voice is among them. I hear him sometimes, when the wind comes from the woods." Her hand closed over Eleanor's. "You've opened the gate wider by seeing it clearly. It knows your name now." The room seemed to dim, the voices from Eleanor's apartment echoing faintly in her mind, as though Margaret's confession had given them permission to draw nearer still. April's damp chill seeped into the apartment, but Eleanor no longer noticed the cold. She had stopped hiding the photograph, stopped turning it face down or covering it with cloth. Instead, she kept it on the small table by the window overlooking Blackwood Forest, where moonlight could reach the mirror's restored surface each night. The voices had grown quieter since Margaret's confession, less frantic, as though the entity now waited with the patience of something ancient and certain. One evening, as rain streaked the glass and thunder rolled low over the treetops, Eleanor caught the first unmistakable movement. She had been reading Victor's diary by lamplight when a flicker in her peripheral vision drew her gaze to the print. The figure in the mirror, no longer a static silhouette, shifted. Its elongated arm lifted slowly, as though testing the air, fingers unfolding like pale branches. The motion was fluid, deliberate, synchronized not with the frozen wedding party but with the real room around her. When she leaned forward, the head tilted in response, the featureless face turning toward her with a grace that made her stomach lurch. She tested it deliberately over the following nights. Standing before any mirror in the apartment, bathroom, hallway, the small one above the dresser, she watched the restored photograph from the corner of her eye. The figure mirrored her actions in delayed echoes. When she raised a hand to her throat, its limb rose moments later. When she stepped left, it drifted in the same direction within the confines of the glass. The boundary between past image and present reality thinned with each repetition, the mirror in the 1925 scene behaving less like a captured reflection and more like a live window. Some nights the movements grew bolder. The figure pressed closer to the surface, its outline sharpening until she could discern the suggestion of fabric, dark, tattered, clinging to a form too tall for any guest in the original crowd. Pale smudges resolved into hollows where eyes should be, and once, under a full moon that silvered the room, she saw the faint curve of a mouth opening in silent speech. The voices accompanied these shifts, no longer distant pleas but intimate murmurs directly against her ear, timed to the figure's gestures as though it conducted them. Eleanor began avoiding mirrors altogether, draping them with towels, but the photograph's glass could not be so easily obscured. The entity used it relentlessly, pacing when she paced, pausing when she froze, its presence bleeding through the frame until the room itself felt reflected in reverse. On the worst nights, when exhaustion forced her to sleep, she woke to find the print turned toward the bed, though she lived alone and locked the door each evening. The figure stood at the foreground of the mirror now, palm pressed flat against the inner surface as if testing its strength, waiting for the moment the barrier would yield entirely. The air carried a faint scent of damp earth and wilted roses, and the temperature dropped sharply whenever the movements began, as though the forest's breath leaked through the widening seam between 1925 and the present. May's restless warmth pressed against the windows as Eleanor stood once more in the stone circle deep within Blackwood Forest, the restored photograph clutched in one hand and Margaret's fragile page of confession in the other. The voices had fallen silent for the first time in months, replaced by a pressure so complete it rang in her ears like the aftermath of an explosion. The entity knew she had come to decide, and the clearing itself seemed to wait, the ancient markers leaning inward as though drawn by the same inexorable pull she felt in her chest. She had returned at dusk, the hour Victor's diary marked as the ritual's commencement a century earlier. The obsidian shard from the center depression glinted in her pocket, warm now against her skin. Margaret had warned her that closing the gate required reversing the invitation, an act of refusal where once there had been welcome, a breaking rather than a binding. Yet the old woman's final words echoed, the entity would not release its hold willingly. It would offer power, knowledge, even companionship to anyone who hesitated at the threshold. Eleanor placed the photograph face up on the depressed ground where the offerings had once lain. Moonlight filtered through the canopy, striking the mirror's surface with a cold clarity that made the figure within it stand out sharply. It no longer lurked at the back of the reflection, it filled the glass entirely, tall and indistinct, its limbs pressed outward as though the frame were a membrane stretched thin. The pale hollows of its eyes fixed on her with an intensity that felt almost tender, and for a moment she understood Victor's temptation, the promise of seeing beyond, of commanding what others feared. The voices returned then, not as pleas but as persuasion. They spoke in layers, Clara's soft assurance that no harm would come if Eleanor stepped closer, Victor's measured promise of secrets worth any price, Elias's weary confession that resistance only prolonged the inevitable. Images flickered across her mind, her own reflection joining the wedding party, timeless and preserved, the forest opening its hidden paths to her alone. The air thickened with the scent of roses long decayed, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to soften, inviting descent. She felt the choice crystallize, to destroy the photograph, shatter the shard, scatter the circle's stones and speak the words of severance Margaret had transcribed from Elias's hidden page, or to accept the outstretched hand waiting in the mirror, to become the new anchor that would hold the gate open for whatever hunger lay beyond. The figure leaned nearer, the glass rippling like water disturbed from the other side, and Eleanor's fingers tightened on the obsidian edge until blood welled warm against her palm. The forest held its breath with her, the boundary between refusal and surrender thinning to a single, trembling instant.